I'm live now, I believe, for everyone who's watching. I hope. We're just confirming that here at this end. Okay, all right. Thank you. We'll just hang up then. Just had my assistant online to make my way through this minefield of technology so that we can have this live broadcast and communication. The only thing that's unfortunate is that I can't see any of you. And I know you're scattered around the globe, so I'm not sure what time it is where you are, but I'm in the United States and it is 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm very pleased that a number of people who have signed up for this course have written that they're enjoying it, getting something out of it, and learning a lot, I hope not too much, about our origins. And there are a number of questions that I'd like to address today, because the field of paleoanthropology, as we look at the newspapers, seems to be carrying something new and exciting every week. Whether it's those discoveries of fossils from southern Africa, the discoveries from Morocco, the announcement of new dates of those fossils from Morocco, the discovery of very fragmentary tooth and evidence from Europe, suggesting that maybe we evolved there rather than Africa, and ongoing issues about the shape of the human family tree. And I think we'll hopefully have time to touch on most of those. One of the first questions that was sent in concerns the affinities of something called Greco-Pithecus. We all know that Pithecus means ape in Greek, and Greco means Greek in Greek. So this is a Greek ape, and there are numerous fossils from a site in Greece known as the Ravine of Rain, presumably because it rains there a lot. And these have been known for quite some time, going back several decades. And they are ape fossils. There's no question about the fact that they're ape fossils. There are complete jaws. There are lots of teeth. There's not so much postcranial, but certainly looking at the teeth and the jaws and the parts of face and so on, these are bona fide apes rather than belonging on the human family tree. They were recently re-examined by a group of authors. Then it was published recently online. And the suggestion is that there are certain features of a particular molar with the joining together of roots that we see more often in hominins than we see in apes. And yes, that's true. But those traits, single traits like that, very often vary. And to simply throw out the mound of evidence from Africa that we evolved there rather than in Europe based on this single tooth, I think is significantly premature. We've got the geographical evidence, we've got the anatomical evidence, we've got the DNA evidence, right? We've got the living apes who are there today, who are so closely related to us, particularly the chimpanzee. And we have a fossil record that goes way back into the Miocene, where there was a significant variety or diversity of apes, out of which this common ancestor arose that gave rise to the African apes and the human apes. Now, is it unusual to find apes in Europe? Is it unusual to find apes out of Africa? Well, no, because during the Miocene, as you may recall from my earlier presentations, the old world was much more tropical up into Europe. And you had apes in Asia. You had apes in France. Remember what is today France, like Dryopithecus. You had these apes called Greco-Pithecus. In Asia, you had Shivapithecus and Ramapithecus and a whole diversity of apes. And in Asia, I think it's interesting in this light to look back at something I spoke about, which is called Ramapithecus. And Ramapithecus was, when I was a student in the 60s, touted as the first hominin, or hominids as we called them in those days. And that was based on a little fragment of jaw with several teeth. But when we found more complete specimens of that, we saw that it was clearly an ancestor to modern orangutans. And I think I may have even suggested in one of my lectures that perhaps it should even be placed in the genus Pongo, like the contemporary orangutans. So the old world was peppered with many, many different kinds of apes. This ape, yes, is about 7 million years old. I don't think the dating is off, but there were many, many apes in Africa. And while it is possible that there was some interchange between some of these apes, we're not really looking at something here that is, in my estimation, closely related to that common ancestor to the African apes and us. In fact, in the early 1980s, my colleague Tim White and I, with one of the discoverers, Louis de Bonis, who is a French paleontologist, who was one of the first people to really dig up these numerous remains of Greekopithecus. And we studied with him the fossils that he had in his laboratory in Paris, I believe it was. It could have been in Poitiers. And there are certain parallels, sort of thick enamel and lower cusp teeth and so on. But that was the same thing we saw in Ramapithecus. And to look at it, something at 7.7 million years, and to connect it with much later lineages, particularly as this one question says, does the Homo lineage require a further update, or is the scientific jury still out? Well, certainly that part of the question, something like Greekopithecus freibergi, or Macedoniensis as it's sometimes called, would not play any role, because we know that the oldest evidence for our own genus, Homo, man, versus the apes, for example, versus Australopithecus, is in Africa. And that date now goes back to 2.8 million years. So I think it's interesting that some of these features have been pointed out. But when you step back and you look at all of the fossils that have been assigned to this particular taxon or species, they're very clearly apes. So I'm not quite sure why that got such attention, except that it would be rather interesting, because as you think back on what I've taught in this course, people thought for well over a century and a half that Europe was the finishing school for humanity. And that, of course, has been totally overturned by the vast storehouse of fossils that we find in Africa. Interesting question, something I don't really touch base on in the course, is a question from a student who asks about this series of skulls that were found in Paracas, Peru. I've never seen these. I'd love to see them. I've been to Peru, but I've never had a chance to see them. And they have very elongated heads. In side view, they wouldn't be rounded like mine. They'd be sort of egg-shaped, sort of like what might be under Nefertiti's crown in Egypt. And the question is, what do you do with this dozen of skulls that look like this, and beautiful full skeletons, and media doesn't seem to be covering it? And I don't know if there's a specific paper on them, But I do know, and this question has come up before and sometimes comes up in my public lectures, but what we're looking at are not aliens. I mean, they look like kind of aliens. Well, they're not coneheads, you know, from Saturday Night Live. These are skulls, human skulls, that have been deliberately deformed by wrapping rope around them or heavy cloth and pushing them into that shape and making them cone shaped. And they may very well reflect very high social status in that society, or some sort of ritual, or perhaps like some of the things that we think, especially the older generation, are so strange, like nose rings and big holes in the ears and pierced body parts and so on, may be just like that. They might be considered to be aesthetically pleasing. You know, wow, look at that. That's a really attractive cone-headed person, okay? It could be something like that. When we talk about, this is art, what we would call in our, you know, we've all got our jargon, what we would call artificial cranial deformation. Now, I'll bet there are people in this class, or people who you know, they don't have to be 2,000 years old. These skulls are about 2,000 years old, to experience cranial deformation. I have a friend whose child was born, and the back of its head was on its side, on this side here, was very flat and very noticeable. The head looked very asymmetric. And we know, aesthetically speaking, that when we look at someone who is, you know, really asymmetric, we kind of dwell on that, and it isn't as aesthetically pleasing as let's call it a normal skull. So they went to a hospital and talked to a doctor who said, well, we can put a hat on him, like a football helmet. And you may have seen some of your friends, or you may get on a subway or a bus or walk down the street and see someone who's got a complete white, usually white, helmets over their head. And you know that the infant is not going off to play football or soccer or something or other. Well, that is exerting forces on a very malleable cranial vault that's still growing to push it back into normal shape so that it doesn't look asymmetric. And people don't say, hey, look at that guy over there with the flat head or something. So that it can happen. It sometimes has happened with infants that sleep only in one place every night, night after night after night. That can make that bone flat because it's still very soft and malleable. Remember, in an early infant's skull, there are sutures, and they are not closed. It's not finished because the brain is still growing, okay? Now, among Native Americans, for example, if you go to some place like the Heard Museum in Arizona, you will see that Native Americans very often, they didn't have, you know, backpacks. They had backpacks, but they weren't like ours. They often strapped the infant to a flat board, a cradle board, as it was called, and the backs of the heads were flat. And when you see a cranium, a brain case, that is in some of our collections in the United States of early Native Americans, you will see the flat-headed, and it's called cradle boarding. And that is deformed because of the pressures that are put onto it. So these skulls from Paracas are intriguing and interesting, but there's a whole study of people, there's a study by someone out there, I'm not quite sure who studies cranial deformation. And we can see that in a number of societies around the world, there was intentional deformation that either raised their social status or may have been aesthetically pleasing. So that's very interesting, because when we look at fossils of early humans, we want to be careful that we're looking at, I mean, if we come up with a skull that's flattened in the back, it's not a new species. It was some developmental or some kind of pressure that had been put on that to deform that skull. So I hope that explains it. Now, I think what has been in the press lately that is incredibly fascinating is a much more ancient estimate for fossils that are found in Morocco, in the northwestern corner of Africa, at a site that has been known since, well, for 40, 50 years, where they found a fairly complete skull. I had a picture of that somewhere, but at any rate, the skulls that were found there, the skull that was found there and the lower jaw that were found there, were thought to be, you know, maybe tens of thousands of years old, not very old. But there was always a real question about this as to whether or not it belonged in our own species. It doesn't look exactly like our skulls, because it's somewhat more ancient and more heavily built in certain parts, like in the brows, for example. But recently, those skulls that site has been redated, and it's about 315,000 years old. So it's a very ancient site where these fossils are very modern looking. Now, does that completely overturn the family tree and our concepts of human evolution? No. What it does is it suggests that these finds in Morocco testify to an earlier appearance of our own species, Homo sapiens. The big attention that was brought to it was that traditionally we thought of sapiens as arising in Eastern Africa. Why? Because that's where the oldest evidence was found. And these were found just north of Lake Turkana in the Omo region, where you may recall I worked in the early 1970s at a site known as Kibish. And when those were first found, they were thought to be maybe, 80,000 or maybe 90,000 years old. They were redated. And the two skulls from Omo Kibish are actually on the order of 195,000, almost 200,000 years in age. Very similar to what's happened with these skulls from Morocco. And in my estimation, looking at the face particularly, and I think you know, or you will see shortly, how strikingly different a Neanderthal face is from ours. Our faces are fairly flat. We have a very prominent nose. We don't have a pulled out middle region. We have a chin, right? These specimens from the Morocco site certainly have an overall anatomy that is very much like our anatomy. They have some differences in the back of the skull that people have said, oh, there's kind of a protrusion or a bun. It's called an occipital bun, or a chignon, as it's sometimes called. But it's not built the same way as sapiens. This as Neanderthals. It's more like our own. Some people have more prominent backs or occipital bones. So while this is terribly important to document the fact that sapiens was running around Africa 300,000 years ago, it just really extends our knowledge further back in time. Now, newspapers love to sell newspapers, and magazines love to sell magazines. And they said, well, no longer is East Africa the cradle of humankind. Now it's Morocco. Well, I'm very careful in my presentations. I gave a public presentation here just recently. And, it was actually, I gave a paper in Spain last year. And I said that people so often misuse, oh, South Africa is the cradle of humankind. Oh, Olduvai Gorge is the cradle of humankind. Oh, Ethiopia is the cradle of humankind. Well, I think, as I've emphasized, ad nauseum probably, that it really, all the major developments we have seen that distinguish us from all other primates made their first appearance in Africa. And when I talk about the cradle of humankind, or as I sometimes call it, the crucible, I'm talking about Africa in general. So while, that might find some argument among people and say, oh, no, it's South Africa. But no, where is the first Homo sapiens? Where the oldest was found. It's as simple. It sounds tautological, but that's the answer to that. The dating was done using a special technique which was not available years ago, which I think I touched on, thermoluminescence, and was under the direction of Jean-Jacques Houblin, who is the director of the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Germany, and is one of the specialists in Neanderthals and sapiens. And he had this long standing hope that he would eventually someday be able to go back to Jebel Irhoud, I-R-H-O-U-D, Jebel Irhoud is the name of the cave, and reopen excavations. And in doing so, one of the most important first accomplishments was being able to provide a solid date for this. Now, I was speaking with someone yesterday about, what's hot in paleoanthropology these days. And in some ways, there is increasing emphasis on trying to unravel and understand the origins of our own particular species, Homo sapiens, and its geographical and temporal extent. And Jebel Irhoud adds a lot to that, and its relationship to other species, like the hobbits, Homo floresiensis, which is obviously an extinct side branch. It got sequestered in the Malay archipelago in Southeast Asia, or something like Homo naledi, which was this just huge concentration of fossils that was found in a cave in southern Africa by Lee Berger and his team. They were sequestered down there for a very long time. They're only 200,000 or 300,000 years old in themselves. They certainly cannot be ancestral to sapiens if sapiens goes back 300,000 years, which is throws another bit of light on the importance of those fossils in southern Africa. And of course, it's very important to find concentrations in multiple specimens like his team did. We don't talk about it much in this course, but these all belong to a species called Naledi, which is probably very much like those fossils found called the hobbits or Homo floresiensis, that there were geographical barriers and places of isolation. And you'll remember in our discussions of species that one of the things that is necessary for a new species to arise through the process of speciation is isolation. so that recombination and mutation and natural selection and so on can work together to craft a new species. And I believe that that's what Homo naledi is. Very interesting fossils, very interesting that there's another group isolated down there that really didn't give rise until anything later, but certainly not a player in this game of Homo sapiens. Now, why are we so interested today as in the 1970s, when the peak of paleoanthropology was focused on Australopithecus, was, I think, multifold. First, the use of DNA to look at archaic sapiens, the use of DNA to look at Neanderthals, the use of DNA to identify a new kind of human for which we really have just fragments, tiny fragments of bone, which are called Denisovans, for example. And also, I think, partly part of our being egocentric, that we really are interested in knowing something about where we came from. The heck with the Australopithecines for a while. So that there has been a greater emphasis on this, and the Moroccan finds, I think, play really an important role in that. And some people didn't send questions. They just said that they're enjoying the course. They've been reading paleoanthropology. An airline pilot wrote in and said that he chose to be an airline pilot, but still has kind of a real interest in knowing about paleoanthropology. I don't expect, all of you to become paleoanthropologists. Heaven's sakes, there'd be much too much competition for us. But we are, and it makes me personally gratified to know that, yeah, this has kind of expanded your view of man's place in nature. Let's see here. This is a very, seemingly very simple question, but I think one that draws us back to Darwin's coming up with the idea of natural selection. And what we mean by natural is that it's what's going out there in the natural world, right? And that there is this tendency for individuals that are better fit for that environment, better adapted to that environment, that live longer, that are more successful in acquiring food and warding off enemies, and looking after or offspring or nourishing them and so on, that there's a selection for those individuals, and individuals who are more successful lead more genes. This is an interesting question, and it just said, it's not even a question, it's just, it would be very nice to hear some words or maybe a suggestion of some sources to read about artificial selection. Now, I don't know how many of you live in a city like I do, but when I go out for a walk, I see dogs of every shape and variety. Some of them have been so artificially selected, these little pugs, that they have trouble breathing. Or some, like dachshunds, have been so heavily artificially selected for this long, sleek look that they have spine problems and back problems. So artificial selection we see everywhere. We see it, unfortunately, in the tasteless tomatoes or tomatoes that you buy in the grocery store. They have been artificially selected to mature in the crate and survive transport, as opposed to the good old-fashioned tomatoes that many of us my age grew up with that tasted wonderfully. And they've not selected them for taste, but for economic reasons. And an aspect, of course, to artificial, so Darwin, I should go back, and but Darwin was very influenced by artificial dog selection of dogs, to have breeds of dogs, as well as artificial selection for an extraordinary diversity of pigeons and pigeon breeders He knew that they were selecting for coloration or texture or whatever, shape and so on. And that meant to him that there must be certain things that are passed from one generation to the next generation. Now, part of this artificial selection is the word domestication, right? We know that with the agricultural revolution, 12, 13,000 years ago, roughly, that there was the domestication of things like sheep and goats, horses, oxen, various grains, and so on. And so domestication and artificial selection go hand in hand. And there was to me, a fascinating, because of its completeness, article published in a magazine, which is called Science News. And if you go online, and we all Google, we're on Google right now, and Google this article, it is, I dug it up here, it's called Rewriting Domestication Origin Stories. Is DNA evidence rewriting domestication stories? And this was in, oh my goodness, let me see if I can find the original article here. Yeah, so it was published in the July 6th issue of Science News. And if you go to sciencenews.org, I think you'll find it's called DNA Evidence is Rewriting Domestication Origin Stories. Fresh ideas emerge about the origins of humans' relationships with their favorite species. And they even touch on the fact that maybe human beings ourselves are domesticated animals. But it's in the July 8th issue, Science News, volume 191, page 20. And it's got a very interactive site that allows you to really look at the wide range of everything from, such as dogs were domesticated about maybe as much as 15,000 years ago. Goats 10,000 years ago, sheep 11,000 years ago, cats about 9,000 years ago. So dogs have been domesticated a lot longer than the family cat. Horses about 5,000 years ago, camels only 3,000 years ago, turkeys about 2,000 years ago, right here in North America where I am. And I found it a fascinating article. And I think you will too. So thank you very much, whoever sent in that question. Something I wouldn't have talked about. Let's see. Someone's written in, as we know, technology is a wonderful thing. Yeah, right. Until you have the problems I had today. I had terrible problems getting onto the site because one of my machines, the email is down and I don't know what's going on, and was running out of power and so forth and so on. And it is certainly a wonderful thing, but sometimes it is maddening. One of the things that separates humans from other primates is our ability to develop and use technology and tools, which I touched on, which is what we call culture. Considering GIS, satellite remote sensing, geophysical analysis, how do you think technology, specifically the automation of jobs, will affect job outlooks? Well, it's going to take jobs away from a lot of people. But this question said specifically in the fields of anthropology and archaeology. Any thoughts about whether the job of an archaeologist can be done by artificial intelligence? Well, you've seen that somewhat outdated course of mine, or a three-part NOVA series. I think there are many more things that people are trying to apply technology to in the world today. that are far ahead of putting anthropologists out of a job. Certainly, they're helping us in all the ways in which this question was phrased. We're able to scan things in ways that we never had, and look inside skulls, and we've talked a lot about that. But I think that certainly field work, for example, it's going to be a long time before you're going to have robots out there running around in the African Rift Valley with recognition devices recognizing the shape of a bone and picking it up. So I think that many of the things we do in terms of excavation, search and discovery, and so on, will be firmly in the hands of Homo sapiens before some computer organized AI, artificial intelligence, is going to take over. But I'm certain that we will see an increasing elaboration of tools that will assist us. Another person said, what are my thoughts on the study published by Dr. Demaray claiming that humans existed in the Americas 130,000 years ago? Baffling. We thought for a very long time that humans only got to North America, say 12,000 years ago. Certainly now a date of 20,000 is acceptable, okay, because older sites have been found and because more directed research has been done. Unfortunately, with global change going on and sea level rise happening, many of those perhaps earlier sites that we saw along the coasts of North America, like Canada and United States, as well as South America, will go back deeper underwater. But think about that. This is 7 times the accepted sort of, well, not quite that much, 20,000 goes there, but 6 times the accepted age for the peopling of North America. Yeah, the sediments might be dated that. The rocks look like they could be artifacts rather than geofacts, but I don't think they are. They're created by some natural process. I think it is impossible, I should say. I've been corrected before, but 130,000 years ago, and then nobody for the next, what, 120,000 years? Nobody. If people had gotten here, we have to think about what that means, okay? When sapiens got into Europe out of Africa at 50,000 years ago, in 10,000 years, the indigenous people, the Neanderthals, were gone, and we were everywhere. We're just that kind of creature. Now, when you think of a species of human, how in the world would they have gotten here 130,000 years ago is a good question also. They certainly weren't taking ocean liners. But let's assume they went all the way down from the Aleutian Islands connecting in the Bering Sea, connecting Asia and the New World, and didn't leave one example of their presence except in that one place. That's also kind of bizarre. But let's assume they did, and they got there. And then they stopped there, and they never went anywhere else. That doesn't make any sense. If they had been that bloody adventurous, to come into terra incognita and make their way down all the way to San Diego, they would have stayed and undoubtedly flourished for many of the same reasons that we did 15, 20,000 years ago when sapiens first came to North America, because it was a virgin territory. It was so rich with resources that we spread from coast to coast in a very few years. More baffling to me is really why this got published. But as it is published, and but that one single bit of evidence seems just out of place for all the reasons I just mentioned. And I'll bet you can think of some others also. Well, this is a question that I'm not going to spend much time on, because I have or will shortly. I'm not quite sure where we are in the course. Why did our ancestors walk upright? And I don't want to criticize the person who asked this question, because here we are, the only upright bipedal creature on the planet, except for birds, right? And hopping kangaroos, maybe, and some lizards, and the dinosaurs were bipedal and they're gone. Why are there 7 billion of us today? Well, it has to mean that bipedalism was good for us. So the question really is, what are the advantages of upright walking that natural selection worked on and selected for? And I give an entire lecture on that, as well as an entire lecture on the anatomy of upright walking and bipedalism. The question goes on, is it possible that some of the early fossils that were found were actually diseased? Yes, absolutely. Particularly if they experienced a disease that left a distinctive signature on bones. And there is a skeleton that I mentioned, I believe, during the course, that suffered from hypervitaminosis A. And what that means is that you should not be eating things like carnivore livers. They cause a very serious disease in your bones that can bring about death. And I talk about that in the course, but you see that on the bones. You see that. We see in some bones where they have been broken and healed, okay? But aside from that, in the fossils themselves, these early hominid fossils, there's a little bit of tooth decay or some sort of a lesion on the jaw that suggested that they might have had, maybe they should have had a root canal like I had last week to save that tooth. But there are very few instances of very old disease. And it's possible that some of those individuals died of diseases that did not affect or show their effect on the bones, and we'll probably never know that. I would guess that, oops, I need my glasses, or one of these pairs of glasses. What if, hypothetically, in a few million years, a few skeletons of men and women with Down syndrome were found, and only them, and our species was constructed on the basis of that evidence? Is it possible that scientists have done the same today? Well, the hobbits, the Homo floresiensis fossils that were found a few years ago on the island of Flores, right at the end of the Malay archipelago, or as we call it, Indonesia today, were thought to be some sort of disease dwarf. And we now know from extensive, wide-ranging studies that this was normal for them. This was not a disease. It would be very unusual to find a group of diseased individuals and to base a new species on that. One would see by looking at a non-disease skeleton that there was something wrong. Down syndrome, for example. I've never studied skeletons of those with Down syndromes. But of course, there are certain markers in those that would show that there was a disease that had affected that. And in LeGros-Clark, who you may remember way back when, wrote that when one is studying ancient fossils, trying to understand them, you have to avoid those with diseases or those that are immature. You don't compare an immature with an adult. And this has played a very important role in the studies of Neanderthals, because Marcelin Boule in Paris in the early parts of 1900 studied the beautiful, to me anyway, beautiful Neanderthal skeleton called from the old man of La Chapelle, and said that it walked very hunched over and bent kneed because the bones looked deformed. Well, yeah, they were deformed. They were deformed because they suffered, that individual suffered arthritis. So to have based a reconstruction of how Neanderthals got around, how they walked, how they locomoted, on a diseased skeleton gave us a wrong answer. And he should have known that, and he didn't. You might look up La Chapelle. I think I may talk about it a little bit, but in the 1950s, I think it was, people looked at it and said, well, this is not what they look like. They were as upright as we are. This one looks like it's bent over because there was a reconstruction based on a misconception that these were normal bones. They were diseased bones. So yes, we keep our eyes open for those sorts of things. I've recently seen a statement that if Auroran proved to be a direct human ancestor, then Australopithecines like Afarensis, Lucy, might be considered a side branch. Could you please share your thoughts about the subject? I have actually one of the few people who've seen the Auroran bones. These are 6 million year old fossils from the Baringo area in north of like the province of Laikipia in Kenya, and they are about 6 million years old. There are 2 femurs and some other teeth associated with them. I think they were bipedal. There's a very characteristic telltale little mark on the top of the neck of the thigh bone or femur that suggests that. But to go from that 7 million year old fossil directly to Afarensis at say 3.8 million and connect them or disconnect them, I think reflects more the view that those discoverers, like most discoverers, including myself, although I think it's substantiated now that Afarensis played a very important role in later hominins. But many people who find fossils are so emotionally invested in them that they want their fossil to be the ancestor to everything. And there still is a question about Auroran tugenensis in terms of its teeth and jaws. And but certainly it's really only the 2 people who wrote about that, who were involved with the discoveries, who put much merit in that interpretation. In the future, as we start to expand into new horizons, and maybe that means space travel, do you think evolution of humans has stopped? Well, I talked about Homo sediba. I talked about the hobbits. When they get isolated like that, reproductively, and are not exchanging genes, and they're isolated long enough, they will move in different evolutionary trajectories. Today, human genes are, how many airplanes are in the air right now as we're doing this? How many people are heading from Australia to San Francisco, where they may be meeting up with their wife and exchanging genes, or meeting someone new and exchanging genes from Australia to here or there or whatever. So we're moving along as a species with a lot of gene flow. So gene, and the rest of this question is that technology is solving most of our problems, right? We aren't doing it biologically, right? If the glaciers started descending on Wisconsin, people wouldn't grow hair. They'd just turn up the heat, right? Light a fire. So the culture is really a buffer. We're still evolving and changing very, very, very slowly. Every time people mate, there's a new combination of genes. But in order to really see significant changes, you would have to isolate reproduction between individuals. And that would mean long-term space travel. That would mean going into space for tens, hundreds of thousands of years. And probably by the time you got back, you wouldn't get back, but your descendants would get back in another 100,000 years. You could genetically be so different that you were unable to mate with the species that had originally sent you into space. I'm sure science fiction writers have written about that. I didn't think we'd have a whole hour to fill here, and we've got a lot of questions. Let's jump ahead. We have 7 minutes left. I know my TA's watching and laughing. Let's see. Sorry about this. Let's see. Trying to finish up with something that's not going to send me off in a long explanation. Someone thanks me for the course. Well, I thank them for being appreciative. Let's see. You know, this is a question of races, which is a word we've tried to stay away from because it is so highly politicized and is really a sociological construct rather than a strict biological construct. But can I shed light on variations in human race? Well, I would say, let's strike the race word and say, can I shed any light on variations in human beings and how that might be connected to history? And that's, the person really knows what they're asking here, as well as a future evolution. Well, if we sent only blonde-haired, blue-eyed astronauts into space, the offspring would be blue-eyed, blonde-haired astronauts because of the founding population that got there. So that, yes, history plays a role, geographical migrations play a role, but you know, it's only recently that these thousands of airplanes have been flying around spreading genes everywhere. Why, when you go to Europe, and I encourage everyone who is undergraduate to take a year off and go to Europe, buy a ticket and go all over and look at Europe. Why do Swedes look like Swedes? And why do Scandinavians look like Scandinavians? Because they marry Scandinavians. That's why. I mean, I visit my family in Sweden, and generally they have, blue eyes and blonde hair. I didn't have the blonde. My father had dark hair and dark eyes, is why I have not had blonde hair. So it has to do with who's marrying whom. Tall people tend to marry tall people. Short people tend to marry short people. Some of these things that we see do have some selective value to them, right? We've talked about sickle cell anemia. When I go to Africa, when I go to a highly malaria area, there's no chance that I'm going to have a natural immunity to malaria because my genes go back to northern Central Europe, where there was not malaria. There was no advantage to continue to have those genes. So there are features within our biology, within the color of our skin. The traditional view, as you well know, we've talked about, is that lighter skin, if you start at the equator and go northward or southward, skin gets lighter and lighter as you move northward, as you get closer to the North Pole. Swedes tend to have very light skin, blue eyes, light colored hair, because there's so much less sunlight there. Darker skin is a protection for the skin and for certain chemicals that are released that are detrimental during pregnancy. So that in Africa, dark skin, or along the equator, dark skin is selected for because it enhances the lifespan of those individuals who are darker skinned. Why is lighter skin selected for in higher latitudes? Well, even 200 years ago, I don't know, 200 years ago, I guess, they weren't going to the store and buying vitamin D fortified milk. They were suffering from rickets. They were suffering from bones that were not developing the way they should. So culture comes in, of course, and forms a buffer to those things. So we go and get vitamin D levels. People who live in Ithaca, New York, I think one of the cloudiest cities in this United States, I imagine most of them are taking vitamin D supplements and vitamin D fortified milk for their children as they're growing up. My question is, why primates? Why did primates, as opposed to any other order of animals, develop into intelligent beings? Well, the other primates are pretty darn intelligent. There's a program now on Animal Planet about apes, chimpanzees in particular. They're pretty darn bright. But why didn't other orders of mammals do that? Well, you don't think elephants are smart? It says, will elephants ever use fire? No, they don't need fire. They live under natural conditions. They're adapted to those conditions. They know how to find the food. They are specifically adapted to that kind of food, but they are socially very complex. And that social complexity has led to a fairly high level of intelligence among elephants. Okay. Will lions ever read and write? Well, I don't think so. But look at different orders of mammals. And I'll end here. But it's very simple. And I hope it's not I'm not trying to be too funny. But if you look at herbivores, cows, goats, animals that eat grass, okay, they're not very bright. You can't really have a cow sit up and roll over or fetch something, right? But look at the carnivores. There is a high selection for intelligence amongst carnivores because they have to plan, prepare, and understand the behavior of their food. In order to run down a gazelle, you have to know something about the environment, how fast that animal's going, the having experience with that, and strategy, and so forth and so on. Carnivores in the home, like cats and dogs, are smart. If we have a herbivore in the house, they're not very bright. So it doesn't take a lot of intelligence to run down a blade of grass, right? Like it takes in a cheetah to run down a Thompson's gazelle. So remember, when we ask these questions, if we're not setting up the wrong question, why primates? Because primates in general live in very complicated societies. They live under fairly complicated conditions. They have extended lifespans and learning periods, and so on. And certainly any of you out there who have a clever dog know that dogs can be incredibly intelligent. Anyway, thanks so much for sitting through this live chat. I enjoyed it, and I hope you did, and wish you all the best in this course. Thanks very much.